Vince McMahon's big problems, a simple story: things aren't going well for Vince McMahon. And it's not just because of his recent legal problems. The guy who used to be the untouchable king of wrestling has been slowly falling apart because of scandals, bad decisions, and losing his power. From his Football League XFL, failing twice and tearing his leg muscles badly at a 2005 wrestling show, 2 fights over creative ideas, and the terrible Chris Benoit tragedy in 2007. McMahon's empire has been hit hard again and again, even when he came back to WWE's board of directors in 2023 while facing more legal trouble. It just made things worse behind the scenes. This is the story of a powerful man's legacy going downhill fast. The big guy starts to fall down. When Vince McMahon came back to WWE in 2023, people didn't celebrate like you'd expect for the man who changed professional wrestling forever. Instead, it made people uncomfortable. After taking a short and quiet break, while facing controversy, McMahon came back to the company, saying he wanted to help guide it through a big change, maybe selling it, which would change the whole industry forever. But most people didn't think that was his only reason. Inside the company, his return shocked everyone. People who worked at WWE said everyone felt really uncomfortable in creative meetings. Writers who had found new freedom under Triple H's leadership suddenly started questioning their own decisions. Wrestling stars who had come back to the company while McMahon was gone now worried about losing their jobs and the creative direction changing. Little by little, problems started building up. People's spirits went down. Old tensions that had been simmering for a long time finally exploded. It was obvious that the old way of doing things, Vince's way, was fighting hard against WWE's new vision after McMahon. Then, in early 2024, Tucker Carlson reported breaking news in the wrestling world. He was talking about a merger that he said would change everything. WWE officially joined up with UFC under a company called Endeavor, creating a new publicly traded company called TKO Group Holdings. On paper, McMahon kept his power by becoming executive chairman, but people inside the company quickly noticed the change. Ari Emanuel, the powerful CEO of Endeavor, wasn't just a partner, he was the boss. For the first time in decades, Vince McMahon had someone above him, someone who could say no to him, override him, and ultimately fire him. This had never happened before. The merger also marked the first time that McMahon's empire wasn't completely under his control, with Endeavor pulling the strings and shareholders demanding answers. McMahon's grip started to get loose, not because he wanted it to, but because it had to happen. The boardroom that used to be ruled by just one voice had become a group of stakeholders, and in this new system, McMahon's habit of making decisions by himself didn't work anymore. The king was still in the castle, but he didn't own the land anymore. But sharing power wasn't the only problem hurting McMahon's comeback. The legal troubles cast a long shadow. While Vince McMahon tried to get back to the top of WWE's throne, a darker storm kept brewing in the background. Legal problems that were kept vague in public but getting more intense behind the scenes hung over his every move like a storm cloud. Since coming back to the public eye, McMahon has been caught up in a complicated web of ongoing legal issues. Official documents stay sealed, and spokespeople speak very carefully. But leaks from multiple news outlets and sources have confirmed what many people suspected. Several investigations, both from companies and the federal government, have been active well into 2025. Some look into bad money management. Others focus on how the company was run internally. What connects them all is how big they are, going back decades, digging deep into WWE's most secret history. Then, in early January 2024, the legal news got tighter. Federal agents searched McMahon's properties and gave him a federal grand jury subpoena. The move was shocking, never seen before, and symbolic. For decades, McMahon had shown himself as untouchable, a bigger-than-life person who couldn't face consequences. But now, the message was clear. No one was above being investigated. Within days, McMahon announced he was quitting TKO Group. It wasn't a planned transition. It wasn't an exit he had planned. It was sudden, jarring, and reactive. WWE's statement after the resignation was cold and businesslike, clearly trying to keep shareholders confident. But behind the corporate language was an unmistakable message. Vince McMahon was no longer in charge, and this time it wasn't his choice. The fallout went beyond just legal consequences. In the public's eyes, Vince McMahon's reputation was quickly getting worse. He had once been the perfect example of ruthless ambition and smart success. Now, he was an aging executive surrounded by scandal, forced to watch from the sidelines as his legacy fell apart under all the scrutiny. Despite not being formally charged with anything, at least so far, the damage has been huge. The investigations have led to massive legal bills and internal reviews, with WWE admitting to spending tens of millions on inquiries related to McMahon's past behavior. Shareholders' trust has been tested. Fans have become skeptical. Employees have distanced themselves. It's a sad picture of a man once seen as the giant of an industry, now seen as a figurehead whose past keeps casting a long and increasingly inescapable shadow. Meanwhile, Vince McMahon's life was falling apart in more ways than one. His body was breaking down. The spinal surgery setback. Behind Vince McMahon's famously muscular body, an iron-tough personality was a body that had quietly taken the beating of decades spent blurring the lines between promoter and performer. In July 2023, reality came crashing down in the form of major spinal surgery, one that would prove to be as symbolic as it was physically devastating. The procedure, reportedly lasting for hours, was described by insiders as intensive and high risk. It involved putting in over a dozen metal screws, rods, and stabilizers to strengthen McMahon's deteriorating spine. It was very different from the theatrical stunts that once saw him get slammed through tables or fall off ladders in front of cheering crowds. This time the stakes weren't TV ratings or crowd reactions. They were much higher. They were his ability to walk. Recovery proved even more brutal than expected. Though initially eager to keep his signature involvement in WWE's creative process, Vince found his energy quickly fading. Sources from within the company noted that he started missing key meetings, delegating more than ever before. His signature late-night calls to writers and executives decreased, replaced by brief check-ins and quiet appearances on Zoom calls. Those around him spoke carefully of a weakened presence, not out of disrespect, but concern. Whispers grew louder. Behind the scenes, was Vince still mentally sharp enough to steer the ship? His famously aggressive, controlling style gave way to a more passive, detached attitude. Some described it as a man dealing not only with pain, but with the creeping realization that his era was ending, not in an explosive scandal or defiant exit, but in a slow fade of relevance and ability. This wasn't the first time he had faced physical challenges, though, as there are a few moments that remain burned into everyone's memory, like the 2005 Royal Rumble. During the chaos of the event's dramatic ending, Vince McMahon, WWE's iron-fisted chairman, stormed down the ramp, furious over a messed-up finish. He had intended to show his authority, to take back control over the storyline in front of millions. But the moment he slid into the ring, his body betrayed him. What happened next was crazy. McMahon collapsed in a twisted heap, unable to stand. In a matter of seconds, he had torn both quadriceps muscles completely off the bone. The sight was shocking. Fans watched in stunned silence. At first, many believed it was part of the show. After all, wrestling is built on illusion. But it wasn't. As McMahon sat with stiff legs and grimacing on the mat, the unmistakable signs of real devastating pain settled in. He was hurt. Seriously hurt. But what came after was perhaps even more telling. Refusing to break character, McMahon continued the segment. He yelled orders at referees. He performed his role, sitting awkwardly in the middle of the ring, legs unable to move. There was no stretcher, no panic, just a man who, even facing catastrophic injury, would not give up control or abandon the show. That moment, equally tragic, absurd, and amazing, became the perfect example of McMahon's personal philosophy. Here was a man in his 60s pushing his body to crazy limits, not because he had to, but because of his pure obsession with dominance, control, and performance. It was more than just a freak accident. It was a symbolic breaking point, a moment when the mask slipped and the price of never-ending ambition was shown clearly to the world. Even years later, that image of McMahon, crumpled yet commanding, stands as one of the most haunting visual metaphors in WWE history. It wasn't just a torn muscle. It was the physical representation of a man stretched too far by the weight of his own empire. The TKO shakeup and corporate cold shoulder. If McMahon's physical problems represented one kind of downfall, the corporate restructuring under TKO Group Holdings delivered another blow, one that cut deeper into his identity as the architect of modern wrestling. This changes everything. The 2023 merger of WWE with UFC under the Endeavor-owned TKO Group Holdings created a new media giant worth billions. Vince McMahon's big problems. A simple story: things aren't going well for Vince McMahon, and it's not just because But it also created something Vince McMahon had rarely encountered: a system of checks and balances he couldn't control. Endeavor's leadership, led by CEO Ari Emanuel and President Mark Shapiro, brought a colder Wall Street-minded approach to the newly formed company. Gone were the days when Vince could approve storylines or override boardroom decisions with a phone call. Under TO, decisions were made by committee, with spreadsheets and performance numbers replacing gut instinct and bravado. By the first quarter of 2024, Vince's position as executive chairman looked increasingly ceremonial. Behind the scenes, Paul Levesque, known as Triple H, who had been building goodwill with talent and fans alike through his creative direction, took firmer control of WWE's TV product. Producers started taking orders from new voices, and McMahon's once dominant shadow grew dimmer by the week. Several accounts from insiders revealed that Vince tried to take back influence on multiple creative angles, only to be rejected. On one occasion, his proposed storyline changes were quietly ignored. On another, an executive reportedly told him, "We're going in a different direction." For Vince McMahon, who had run WWE with absolute authority since the early 1980s, such dismissals had once been unthinkable, but they were now routine. Perhaps most telling was the tone of internal emails and memos. While once described with respect as Mr. McMahon, his name started appearing less frequently in strategic discussions. The corporate mood shifted from one of loyalty to one of polite detachment. For some within TKO, Vince was no longer a cornerstone of the company. He was a leftover from another era, tolerated for his legacy, but excluded from the future. He had once built the empire brick by brick. Now he was watching it evolve without him, brick by modern brick. A long history of problems comes back. The year 2025 may be one of the darkest in Vince McMahon's long career, but it is definitely not his first time going through chaos. For decades, McMahon has lived and operated on the edge, fueled by ambition, surrounded by spectacle, and chased by controversy. The current storm of legal troubles is just the latest chapter in a much longer story of crisis management and personal reinvention. In 1994, McMahon found himself standing in a federal courtroom facing charges that could have destroyed the empire he built. Accused of giving anabolic steroids to WWE performers, McMahon's trial gripped the nation and threatened the very future of professional wrestling. At stake wasn't just his freedom, but the survival of WWE itself. Although he was ultimately found not guilty, the trial revealed how fragile the McMahon myth truly was. The iron-fisted mogul was suddenly human, vulnerable, publicly dissected, and nearly brought down by the same system he'd long outmaneuvered. Fast forward to 2007, and another crisis erupted. This time, it was tragedy that shook WWE to its core. The shocking death of wrestler Chris Benoit, who killed his wife and son before taking his own life, forced an unprecedented reckoning within the wrestling world. Autopsies revealed Benoit's brain had been severely damaged by years of trauma, sparking widespread discussions about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, in contact sports. But beyond the medical implications, the spotlight turned to WWE internal culture, brutal schedules, unchecked aggression, and a long-standing blind eye to the physical and psychological toll on performers. McMahon, once again, was in the eye of the storm. Though WWE introduced a revamped wellness policy in the aftermath, many critics argued the move was reactive, not proactive, an attempt to save face rather than fix a broken system. But that wasn't all. One of the biggest controversies was still to come: the XFL, a gamble McMahon made not once but twice. Vince McMahon always saw himself not just as a giant of wrestling, but a mogul who could redefine American entertainment. The XFL was supposed to be his masterpiece outside the wrestling ring, a fusion of his showmanship with America's favorite sport. But what happened was a spectacular double failure that exposed the limits of even McMahon's confidence. In 2001, the original XFL launched with massive hype, backed by McMahon's WWE empire and NBC's national reach, marketed as a grittier, more exciting version of football, with no fair catches, no extra points, and cameras in the locker rooms. The league promised to bring the same attitude that made pro wrestling a cultural force. The first game drew nearly 15 million viewers, a stunning start. But by the second week, the cracks were already showing. The gameplay was awkward. Players, many of whom had been overlooked by the NFL, struggled under unfamiliar rules. Production gimmicks like on-field microphones and cheerleader storylines came off as cheap. Ratings nosedived, critics panned it as football for wrestling fans, and not in a flattering way. Within weeks, NBC pulled out. Within months, the league folded, taking with it a reported $70 million loss. McMahon, undeterred, never forgot the sting. In 2018, he announced a comeback, XFL 2.0, this time under a new company, Alpha Entertainment, separate from WWE. He personally funded it by selling $100 million in WWE stock, determined to do it the right way, and by 2020, the revamped XFL launched to moderate success. It featured legitimate football, experienced coaches, transparent officiating, and tight broadcasting partnerships. Fans and critics were cautiously optimistic. Then the COVID-19 pandemic struck just 5 weeks into its season. The league suspended operations. McMahon tried to keep it afloat, but the pandemic's financial impact was too severe. Within months, he filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The XFL's assets were later sold to a group led by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, one of Vince's former Golden Boys, marking a poetic, if bittersweet, end to McMahon's football ambitions. These twin failures didn't just drain his fortune, they punctured the myth of McMahon's invincibility. The XFL saga remains a case study in overreach, where even the boldest promoter couldn't manufacture success outside the existing system. As such, from federal courtrooms to public relations disasters, McMahon's life has been defined as much by turbulence as triumph. And in 2025, it's as if all those past fractures, once covered up by spectacle and swagger, are now reopening, leaving nowhere left to run. Things aren't looking good for Vince McMahon. The stock market doesn't forgive. Unfortunately, his failures were not only felt through disappointing ventures and personnel drama, but also in the realm of finance. If perception is reality in the world of finance, then Vince McMahon's fall from grace has been sharply felt on Wall Street, following his abrupt resignation amid intensifying legal challenges. Shares of TKO Group Holdings, WWE's parent company, didn't just dip, they staggered. Investors, long used to associating McMahon with dominance, now saw a company navigating uncharted waters. The very man who once symbolized power and profitability had become a liability, though TKO quickly moved to frame his exit as a forward-looking decision, an opportunity to shed controversy and embrace a new era. The markets were less forgiving. In a volatile economic climate, the uncertainty surrounding leadership and brand direction was enough to rattle confidence. Financial analysts were divided. Some viewed McMahon's departure as a net positive, arguing it distanced WWE from legal distractions and allowed for a fresh public image under the leadership of Paul "Triple H" Levesque and CEO Nick Khan. Others worried about the vacuum left behind. McMahon was more than a figurehead. He was the architect of WWE's rise, the singular visionary behind decades of programming, pay-per-view, spectacle, and international expansion. Could the company sustain its identity without him? And more importantly, could it grow? The doubts deepened when earnings calls became noticeably more cautious. Sponsorship deals, streaming partnerships, and licensing contracts, all reliant on WWE's clean, family-friendly appeal, came under renewed scrutiny. Executives offered assurances of stability, touting consistent viewership metrics and expanding international markets. But behind the optimism, there was tension. What happens when the brand becomes bigger than the man, yet the man's shadow still lingers? Even after stepping down, McMahon's influence wasn't fully gone. His fingerprints remained on creative decisions, corporate structure, and long-standing partnerships. That lingering association, to some investors, was a red flag. While TKO Group hasn't collapsed, the tremors are real. A company once buoyed by the presence of an indomitable founder is now navigating the choppy waters of reinvention. The market, unlike McMahon's audiences, doesn't respond to charisma or legacy. It responds to clarity. And until TKO can convincingly separate itself from the ghosts of its past, including Vince McMahon's, investors may continue to hold their breath. And then, of course, there is the breakdown of relationships within his beloved WWE. Despite all the turmoil and controversy, how have things fared with the other wrestlers themselves? Turbulent relationships within WWE, the house that Vince divided. For all the grandeur, pyrotechnics, and standing ovations, Vince McMahon's WWE empire has always simmered with quiet rebellion. Beneath the spectacle lay an empire held together by strict control, creative rigidity, and fear. And over the decades, that control bred resentment, not just among wrestlers, but within Mick's own family. Vince's leadership was authoritarian by design. He was the final word on every storyline, every match outcome, every character arc. Wrestlers, many of them artists in their own right, found their creativity stifled. CM Punk, one of the most outspoken stars in WWE history, eventually walked out in 2014 and later accused the company of medical negligence, creative neglect, and systemic disrespect. His scathing podcast appearances laid bare what many wrestlers had whispered behind the scenes. WWE, under Vince, was a machine that chewed people up. Others followed suit. Sasha Banks and Naomi famously walked out of a live show in 2022 after disputes over creative direction. Bray Wyatt, despite being one of the most innovative performers of his generation, was abruptly released in 2021. The common thread: frustration with inconsistent booking, ignored ideas, and MMahon's refusal to adapt. Even the McMahon family was not immune. Shane McMahon, Vince's only son, was once positioned as the heir to the empire, but repeated internal clashes over booking decisions, business strategy, and generational differences led Shane to walk away multiple times. His most recent fallout in 2022 reportedly stemmed from creative disagreements during the Royal Rumble event, leading to a quiet but noticeable exile. Stephanie McMahon, Vince's daughter, served as WWE's chief brand officer and later co-CEO after Vince's brief retirement in 2022 amid misconduct allegations. But even she resigned suddenly in early 2023. Just as Vince returned to power via a corporate boardroom maneuver, many insiders saw her departure as a symbolic turning point. A daughter pushed out by a father unwilling to release control. Behind closed doors, the WWE locker room has been described as toxic under Vince's reign. Stories of hazing, favoritism, and abusive backstage politics were common knowledge. Some wrestlers thrived under the pressure. Others burned out, disappeared, or fled to rival promotions like AEW, where creative freedom became a selling point. McMahon's stubborn resistance to change didn't just cause internal drama, it affected the product. Fans criticized repeated storylines, over-reliance on aging stars, and the marginalization of fresh talent. WWE may have grown financially, but culturally it stagnated. And while Vince's business instincts were often praised, his people management left a trail of broken relationships and unfinished legacies. The cracks in the foundation became more visible as wrestling culture itself evolved. Social media allowed wrestlers to speak out, fans to organize, and new promotions to rise. WWE under Vince increasingly felt like a relic, one where innovation clashed with ego, and the family behind it fractured under the weight of its own mythology. Ultimately, Vince McMahon's story is no longer just about building an empire. It's about the cost of holding on to it for too long. From explosive scandals to failed ventures and public mishaps, McMahon's grip on the wrestling world has weakened, revealing cracks in both his legacy and leadership. As legal investigations intensify and WWE moves forward without his full creative control, the final chapter of McMahon's influence may already be underway. Written not in triumph, but in cautionary legacy. What do you think was a major contributor to his downfall? What was the most astounding thing you learned? Why? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world of the rich and famous. Thanks for watching. Until next time.